Welcome to The Inside Track. My name is Grace Shie, and I'm joined by my partner, Max Del Rey, here in Washington, D.C. In prior episodes, we've reviewed the immigration priorities and activities of Immigration and Customs Enforcement, or ICE, and of U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services. Today, we turn to another agency, the U.S. Department of Labor, to review its mandate in the area of immigration and immigration enforcement. On September 19th, 2025, the Department of Labor, or DOL, announced the launch of Project Firewall. And reading from the press release, Project Firewall is, and I quote, an H-1B enforcement initiative that will safeguard the rights, wages, and job opportunities of highly skilled American workers by ensuring employers prioritize qualified Americans when hiring workers and holding employers accountable if they abuse the H-1B visa process. That's the end of the quote. So, Max, why don't we begin our discussion today on what that stated mission means for H-1B employers?
Sounds good, Grace. The project shines a light on employers' H-1B programs and practices, and in particular, compliance with wage level requirements and other standards of the H-1B program. So as we know, the H-1B is a visa type that's commonly used by U.S. employers when hiring skilled foreign workers. And DOL plays a specific role in that visa program through its governance and oversight, particularly of wage requirements for the H-1B. And that's one place where we expect enforcement activity to be focused.
Okay, so a focus on wages.
Yeah. The DOL announcement also notes that Project Firewall will include investigations certified by the Secretary of Labor, where there is reasonable cause to believe that an H-1B employer is lacking in compliance. An employer found to be out of compliance with H-1B regulations, for instance, risks liability for back wages, civil money penalties, debarment from future access to the H-1B program, and potential referral for criminal investigation.
So this sounds like a significant undertaking for the agency. And we've seen in prior contexts or other contexts, such as worksite enforcement, that other federal agencies can come together to work on these types of initiatives.
Definitely, we see that here too. The announcement confirms that DOL will plan to coordinate with other government agencies for Project Firewall, including, for instance, the Department of Justice, the EEOC, and USCIS, U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, in an effort to exchange information and obtain referrals.
So why don't we next turn to the DOL's role in an H-1B filing? If they're going to be enforcing in this area, let's first talk about the role that they play. You've already mentioned their role in their focus on wages. What does that mean?
Got it. Yeah. So it's critical to understand DOL's role in this program, the H-1B program. It centers around a prerequisite to file a certain form in an H-1B petition. And that's submission of what's called a labor condition application. We call this an LCA with Department of Labor. The LCA includes several attestations from the employer regarding the working conditions in which the H-1B worker will be placed. Including, for instance, employer information, who they'll be working for, as well as the worker's occupation, their worksite, where they'll be working, and their salary, how much money they'll be paid. So the LCA, for example, might say that an employer will employ, let's say, a software developer in New York City at a set salary. So before that LCA can be filed with the Department of Labor, it first must be posted, either electronically or in hard copy, by the employer in a fashion that makes it available for viewing by other workers at the proposed H-1B worksite. So, for instance, in the New York City example, this could be physically posted in an office in New York City. That's the stated worksite. After that posting takes place, the LCA can be submitted to the Department of Labor for processing. That's normally a 7-day process. The LCA itself, this document, must also be maintained by the employer together with other compliance documents in what's called a public access file. Um, and finally, the DOL, will review that LCA, like I said, on a normal kind of 7-day clock, and what's called certify the LCA, approve the LCA for use in, for instance, an H-1B petition. And a certified LCA must be included in that H-1B petition for the foreign worker. That's mandatory. Every H-1B petition has this DOL document, this LCA.
So you've laid out quite a process, many requirements, but breaking this down, there is procedure to follow. For example, you described the posting requirement, and there are different ways to post. You've described logistics around how to post and to provide notice to American workers. Sounds like there's also sequencing that has to take place very specifically. Posting takes place first, and then the LCA can be filed. And then, of course, you ended with document retention requirements, like the creation and maintenance of a public access file. So I'd imagine that employers that are not as familiar with all of these requirements, in hearing that, does this process that you've described leave room for error?
So I'll give you the lawyerly answer, Grace. It depends, right? So risk of error can be managed and mitigated with training and well-established internal processes. But of course, any process is subject to some level of human error margin. But areas that employers can focus and stress test on, and which are likely to be the subject of Project Firewall or any DOL investigation into H-1B workers, include, in particular, wage compliance, occupational code and wage level selections, and we'll talk a little bit more about this, worksite compliance, pre-submission posting, that process we
Yeah.
just described,
Mm-hmm.
and then maintaining that public access file.
Okay. So then let's shift then. Let's turn to solutions. And let's take them one by one, break it down. What are the top 5 areas where employers can address H-1B compliance proactively? Let's start with number 1.
Yeah, most definitely. Number 1 is wage compliance. This is going to be, we all assume, one of the focuses of Project Firewall.
Mm-hmm.
So confirming that every H-1B worker is paid the higher of what's called the actual or prevailing wage, and that number, that salary, is consistent with what is attested to on that certified LCA document. This is a regulatory requirement, so one that all employers employing H-1B workers have to abide by. And then ensuring the payment of wages even during non-productive times. There may be times when an employer doesn't have work for an H-1B worker to do. They're a consultant or something like that, and there's no project. Employers must pay workers that LCA amount of money even during this non-productive, what's called like benching time, unless the employee is unavailable for work because of a personal reason, a voluntary reason that's not work related.
Okay. So at the top, paramount, wage compliance. Let's move to number 2. What's the second suggestion?
All right. So as we were describing before, LCAs also must just define where someone will be working, the work site, the location. So worksite accuracy is another area of focus for LCA documents. And we see this in our work all the time, where an H-1B worker might be relocating within a company from one office to another. They're going fully remote, etc. So it's important for employers to review all current H-1B employees' work sites, their actual work sites, against what is stated in LCAs, and making sure that those locations are consistent. Make sure that those postings that have to happen in advance of submission are properly done for each work site where the H-1B worker will be working. And then, having to evaluate other arrangements that you may have made with an employee for remote work, hybrid work, other changes that may have happened, for instance, during the COVID period, that were accurately and actually captured in LCAs during that period and to present, of course. And in some cases, those types of locations required other actions as well. For instance, having to amend someone's H-1B approval to reflect that new location.
So you mentioned an amendment. That sounds like an employer in the course of reviewing worksite accuracy. There's an opportunity now to make a correction or to remediate if needed.
Definitely, there absolutely is.
Okay, so number 2 is worksite accuracy. What's number 3?
All right, so now let's talk about public access file maintenance. Employers should have a periodic process, a regular process to review each, we call it a PAF, a public access file, to ensure it includes that certified LCA and a number of other documents that are required for purposes of this process, prevailing wage source, actual wage explanation, a summary of benefits, and other evidence that is required. So confirm those files are complete, accurate, and readily available for public inspection or DOL review when that time may come.
So just as with my prior question, I want to apply that question here. What happens if an employer finds gaps in the documentation in the course of the reviews of these public access files? Here, is there also an opportunity to make a correction?
Yes. Through an audit process, for instance, there are specific ways to properly make corrections, including adding a memo to file, for instance, in some cases as required. When making corrections and doing these types of audits, we think it's really important to seek legal counsel as part of that process for the best results, frankly.
No. And this leads to the question, is an employer required to keep or maintain a public access file indefinitely? Is there a retention period?
Yeah, I wrote it down before this podcast to make sure I got it right. So it's 1 year beyond the last day a worker was employed under the LCA. So what that means generally is 1 year after the LCA expires, or if the worker has separated from the company or has begun working on a new LCA based on a new LCA, 1 year from that transition point, from that separation, or working under a new LCA. Some LCAs are ultimately never used to employ a worker. In those cases, it's 1 year from the LCA expiration, as I was mentioning before, or 1 year from what's called withdrawal of the LCA. Employers have the opportunity to request to DOL that the LCA be withdrawn. So 1 year from that.
Okay.
There's another related retention period in that public access file, and that is payroll records. Payroll records must be maintained for 3 years beyond the pay period, in essence.
Okay. So important retention period rules to be applied and to be included as part of these PAF reviews. Okay. So that's number 3. What's number 4?
Change management protocols. This is kind of a built-up way to say making sure that your organization, your HR, your talent acquisition, your people leaders are able to have a process and a procedure to escalate changes in an H-1B worker's job duties, job locations, or their compensation, and that there is a compliance lens on those changes. So assess whether each change requires, for instance, a new LCA or a new H-1B petition to be filed, and doing those things before the actual implementation of the change.
Before. I think that's the key.
Before.
Okay. And what's number 5, our final suggestion?
So this is like a very kind of holistic, all-encompassing suggestion, and that is training and auditing. It will help with numbers 1 through 4 that we've talked about already. But train your HR staff and your line managers and others in kind of the compliance area on LCA obligations and record keeping. Providing first response type of guidance for DOL site visits or other inquiries from government officials. So making sure someone who would be that first line of response is ready for an inquiry. And then again, like we were mentioning before, having a process to review, audit, cross-check job descriptions, offer letters, performance evaluations, other work product against the standards and what is disclosed in an H-1B filing and in the LCAs. Does that line up? Does that all make sense when viewed holistically? And then the final thing we recommend there is conducting mock audits, internal audits, to identify process gaps, identify any issues with compliance before it's live and DOL is asking for those same things.
So to summarize, Our top 5 suggestions for H-1B employers. 1, assess your wage compliance. You emphasize that as a top priority. 2, assess worksite accuracy in the documentation. 3, reviewing your public access files and remediating where permitted. 4, establishing protocols to manage changes to an H-1B worker's job conditions, because amendments or other government notifications might be required. And 5, engage in training and auditing, as you've described. And the goal of these suggestions is to be prepared for an audit or other enforcement activity by the Department of Labor. Does that sum it up, Max?
Exactly right, Grace.
Okay. Well, thank you for joining us today. We hope that you've found this session helpful in understanding the parameters of Project Firewall and some proactive steps to take in view of the enforcement lens that is to be applied by the Department of Labor. This wraps up our episode of The Inside Track.